This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs.
Tonight's program will focus on parasitic diseases in third world tropical countries. As an overview, neglected tropical diseases affect millions of people around the world, but there is little to no interest on the part of pharmaceutical industry in developing effective drugs because these are diseases of people living in poor countries, underdeveloped regions in the world. We will try to explore the moral and ethical considerations and the challenges of developing vaccines, diagnostics, and drug treatment for these diseases in the absence of profitable financial markets. Our speaker tonight is Dr. James McCarrow, the Dean of UCSD's Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. He is also the Associate Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences at UCSD. Dr. McCarrow came to UCSD from UC San Francisco, where he served as Professor of Pathology and Director of the Center for Discovery and Innovation in Parasitic Diseases. That center is a consortium of academic and industry scientists dedicated to the discovery and development of new drugs for neglected tropical diseases. Dr. McCarrow obtained his MD degree and completed his internship at State University of New York at Stony Brook School of Medicine. He completed his residency in pathology at UC San Francisco and then obtained a PhD in biology from UC San Diego. So he has a very varied educational background. At the Skaggs School of Pharmacy, Dr. McCarrow continues his work on the issue of neglected tropical diseases. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McCarrow.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking about developing drugs for neglected diseases, but more specifically, as Nancy alluded to, I'll be talking about the issues in developing drugs for neglected tropical diseases. So tropical diseases are caused by parasites. So because some of you probably know exactly what a parasite is and maybe others of you do not, I should first define what we're talking about here. So the name parasite actually comes from the Greek parasitou, and there's several definitions which probably will put this into context for you. A parasite is a professional dinner guest or one who lives on the generosity of others. But my favorite definition actually comes from a Roman author. It's the name of a class of priests who had meals at public expense. Right? So by this definition of a parasite, probably all of you know parasites, right? But the modern definition is a set of organisms that range from very simple single-cell protozoa. I think everyone has heard about malaria. I'll tell you a little bit about a disease that's produced by this weird protozoan called a trypanosome. But these organisms go all the way up the ladder to very complex multicellular worms, such as the flukes and the tapeworms. And I'll mention a disease caused by one of these organisms as well. So why do we call these neglected tropical diseases? Well, it seems rather a paradox because these are diseases which affect hundreds of millions of people in the world. And yet I would say that probably most of you have not heard of many of them, let alone can pronounce them. And yet they are major global health problems. Probably the most widespread, prevalent health problems that we have to deal with. Despite the fact that they affect that many people, unfortunately, in many cases, we don't have effective drugs, or if we have drugs that are effective against the organisms, they're not safe. They have serious side effects. And then in addition, we have the problem of drug resistance, which is a problem that I think many of you know plagues antibiotic therapy, even against bacterial diseases, and certainly against diseases like tuberculosis. So why do we have this paradox of a set of diseases that affect so many people in the world? We're talking about them being the major health problems in the world, and yet we don't have therapies for any of them. And some of you may know already that the issue here is there's little or no interest in the pharmaceutical industry in developing drugs for these diseases. And the reasons are what Nancy just mentioned, that is that these are diseases primarily of poor people in poor regions of the world, so they don't represent a viable market. And that's our first ethical concern and the first ethical question that we have to deal with. So that's why these diseases are called neglected, because of this lack of interest. And that lack of interest is really important because if you look at the pathway by which a drug is developed, most of that pathway is handled by the pharmaceutical industry. So this is an example of this pathway. It's often called a pipeline, sort of like the pipe that takes fluid from one place to another. This slide was actually given to me several years ago by a friend of mine who works in a large pharmaceutical company. And so if you look at the time and cost of drug development, 10 years is probably about right, but I would say now that this number is probably about half of what most companies would tell you it costs them to bring a single drug to market. It's probably more like $1 billion. So if you talk about what most laboratories, academic laboratories, government laboratories, nonprofit, institutional laboratories work on, it's only this first box. And that's basically identifying what the targets would be for your new drug. Every one of these further steps are steps that are generally carried out in the pharmaceutical industry. These first two require a lot of chemistry help, so there's a lot of chemists in the pharmaceutical industry. These things called phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is when the drug first goes into people. This would be a safety study, this would be an efficacy study, and this is the big study that you would do, basically double-blinded to see whether your drug works for a very large population. And then finally, there's this thing called file and launch, and that's after the FDA in our country would approve your drug for whatever use it's going to have. It's all of your marketing costs. So this is a big deal. If there's little interest in the pharmaceutical industry in carrying out this development pathway, then how is it going to be done? And it's sort of a disconnect between a huge health problem and really a lack of attention to it. And you can look at companies, I think probably many of you know these statistics. I just picked 4 of the large pharmaceutical companies. And they are very large now, and I think many of you know this just by reading the popular press, for example, that there's been a series of huge mergers over the last 10 years. So a lot of the companies that used to make drugs in competition with each other, Warner Lambert, Upjohn, Park Davis, SmithKline Beecham, they're gone. They've been swallowed up by a few larger companies. And so I just picked 4 here to give you an idea of what's estimated to be their net worth. It's very large. This is a very profitable industry. And the number of people that they employ, which is also very large. So you can see that, if you start getting into this world of drug development, really you're talking about an industry that's large, profitable, a lot of resources, and a lot of people. But despite that, the issue that we all face is that the number of new drugs that are made every year, despite this huge investment, is vanishingly small. So this graph just shows you what's happened since 1950, 1960 here. If you're sitting in the back and can't read this axis, that's okay. This is about 2010. And this is the number of basically new drugs that have been developed for each $1 billion spent in research and development, okay? So $1 billion would buy you about 50 drugs back in 1950, but $1 billion buys you less than 1 drug now. So that's why companies talk about the need to make the next blockbuster drug. You probably heard this term. Blockbuster drug means something that you go out and sell it, you're going to make $1 billion, and and you're going to recoup your costs, and hopefully you'll make $2 billion, and you have $1 billion of profit, okay? So you can imagine, you start to think about it, that this is not going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not going to happen in many parts of Central and South America. This is not going to happen in Southeast Asia, because you just don't have those kinds of huge markets that will give you these blockbuster drugs. And so here's the sad state of affairs. 10% of research and development costs are dedicated to illnesses that affect 90% of the world. So in other words, these big neglected diseases only garner about 10% of research and development costs. I think there's another way to look at this. I think the better way to look at this is to say that 90% of the research and development money that goes into drug development for diseases that affect only 10% of the world's population. And you can guess who those 10% are. They're people who can afford to buy those drugs. Okay. If we talk about these neglected diseases, less than 4% of the new products that come out are for these neglected diseases. Overwhelmingly, the new products that come out are for diseases which affect wealthier people in Western countries. And this 4%, actually, we're talking about not really new drugs, we're talking about reformulations of existing drugs, or maybe combining a couple of drugs. I mean, you've seen this happen, for example, with prophylaxis for malaria, or you've probably read about it in the newspaper in terms of how do we treat multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Okay, this is combinations, reformulations. So if we talk about really new drugs, and this is a FDA terminology, is called new chemical entity. We're talking about a novel drug here, okay? Really only about 1% of all of these new drugs are meant for these neglected diseases. That's really sad if you consider how many people are affected, okay? And you can imagine just about 1% of all clinical trials are for these diseases. And so the bottom line here is that if you look at all the global health investment, only 1% of it is for these diseases which affect hundreds of millions of people and represent the major global health problems. So I would say that if you look at this, this is your ethical dilemma. Is this justifiable or is it not? And that's the question I'm going to have you ponder. Okay. Now, I know a lot of you are interested in what do we mean by neglected diseases. So let me show you a couple of examples just to put this into perspective. So the first example is a disease that is thought to have led to the demise of this man, who is? Charles Darwin. Okay, so Charles Darwin, as everybody knows, went to the Galapagos Islands and studied speciation on the Galapagos Islands as a major foundation for his theory of evolution. But in order to study species there, he had to compare what happened to those animals when they went and were isolated on those islands versus the same species on the west coast of South America. So he actually spent a lot of time in the west coast of South America, including in the Mendoza province in Argentina. So this is from his diary, 1839. At night, I experienced an attack, for it deserves no lesser name, of the binchuca, the great black bug of the pampas. If a finger was presented, the bold insect would immediately protrude its sucker, make a charge, and if allowed, draw blood. So what Darwin was describing was he was describing sitting there and letting this thing bite his hand, and this is actually the vector for a disease called Chagas disease. Chagas disease is the leading cause of heart failure in Latin America. Darwin died of heart failure, okay? So the speculation is that he probably contracted this disease when he was in the west coast of Latin America. Now these things, you know, if any of you are bug people, these are like shield bugs. And in fact, not to scare you too much, but we have this vector in San Diego County. You can definitely find it maybe in some of your backyards. So just to put this in a broader perspective, Chagas disease, as I mentioned, is the leading cause of heart failure in Latin America. And I think this comes as a surprise to a lot of people because they go, wait a second. I thought heart failure was really due to high cholesterol or diabetes or high blood pressure. Yeah, but not in South America. It's due to a parasite. That is the leading cause of heart failure. Currently, there's probably, it depends on whose numbers you take, somewhere around 10 million. The numbers go from 8 million to 20 million people who are infected. And the CDC is currently calling this an emerging infection because they estimate there's probably 300,000 people in the US, and I can tell you there's probably a lot of people in San Diego County with this disease. There's no vaccine. In fact, I can just tell you, for none of these parasitic diseases, none of these neglected tropical diseases is there a vaccine, nor is there a vaccine on the horizon. And in this particular case, as is often the case, there's no effective or safe drugs to treat this disease. In fact, in the US, where we maybe have at least 300,000 people infected, the FDA has approved no treatment for this disease. There is not a single drug approved for human use in the US for Chagas disease. Chagas disease is so important, it occurs on money. This is the 10,000 cruzado note from Brazil. Unfortunately, due to inflation in Brazil, this is no longer in circulation, but it has on it Carlos Chagas, the physician scientist who identified the parasite. I tell my students, you know, this is never going to happen in the US. I mean, a scientist on money? You know, this is, okay. And here he is on the back, you know, on his microscope. And then instead of the motto, you know, take out your dollar bill, you know, e pluribus unum, you know, on your dollar bill. But here, look, you know, I just blow this up and I can tell you here, the parasite life cycle's right there on the money, right? Here's this benchuca, this kissing bug, taking a blood meal, shown very nicely on the money. And then just to say, well, how does this parasite get into you? Okay, well, this bug, which is about this big, okay, and sucking your blood. I mean, think of it like a vampire cockroach, okay? It comes out at night. It tends to bite around the mouth or the eye. That's why it's called a kissing bug. And it has a wonderful reflex. Every time it takes a blood meal from you, it defecates. Shown nicely on the money. Here's the bug poop right here, okay? And so what happens is this thing bites you at night, and you go, oh my God, this big thing. And so what do? You scratch it off, right? You wake up and you scratch it off, and you inadvertently scratch the feces into your skin, and that's how the parasite gets entry. And it gets in your bloodstream, goes to your heart muscle, all shown on the money here, and then it replicates in the heart muscle, kills the heart muscle over time, and that's how you get heart failure, okay? So that's how this disease comes together, okay? So that's a protozoan parasite, Trypanosoma cruzi, single cell organism, okay? Now you know how you get it. This is a huge problem, not only in South America and Central America now, but also in the US, and yet we don't have any drugs because primarily this is a disease which is transmitted in rural areas to predominantly poor people, and so there's really no market for it. Now the second disease, because I know you'd probably be interested in what's the spectrum of these parasitic diseases. So I thought, you know, hey, I'm going to give you an example of a military officer with a parasite in his bladder after serving in the Middle East. And I think most of you, oh, wait a second, I know, this is my nephew. My nephew was in the service in Afghanistan and he came back and he had some kind of parasite. This is him. No, this is him, Napoleon. So Napoleon, as some of you may know, had an expedition to Egypt with his army in 1790-93. What he was trying to do is trying to cut off the path by which the British were getting things from India, right? So he wanted to cut off the connection between Britain and its big colony in India. And while he was in Egypt, he was already suffering from hemorrhoids. So how do you treat hemorrhoids? Well, you take sitz baths, okay? So unfortunately, Napoleon took his sitz baths from Nile water. And it turns out that in Nile water, there's a parasitic larva that goes right through your skin. So this parasitic larva went right into the imperial tuchus, okay? And he got schistosomiasis, also called bilharzia. And this is a disease probably that many of you haven't, if you haven't heard of, few of you can pronounce it. But let me put it into context for you. Everybody knows about diabetes. It's a terrible disease. The WHO estimates there's probably 100 million people in the world who have insulin-dependent diabetes. Huge, huge number. There are 250 million people in the world with schistosomiasis. But Most people in this country have never heard of it, okay? It comes to you because there are these snails that are living in fresh water, and these snails will release little larvae into the fresh water. Those larvae will go right through your skin, okay, and get into your bloodstream, and then they'll develop into adults. And so you'd think, oh, well, hey, I know how to stop this. Let's get rid of the snail. So in the 1950s, there was a lot of effort by chemical companies to develop what are called molluscicides that kill snails. So they dumped all these molluscicides into waters in places like Africa and Brazil. And what did they do? Yeah, they killed some snails, but then they also killed off the fish, and then nobody had any protein, so that sort of went away. So suffice it to say, and if you've ever tried to get rid of snails in your garden, you know this, that snails do really well. We do really well. Therefore, the parasite has done really well. And it's around today, and who gets it? Well, people like car washers in Kenya. If you've ever been to Kenya, you know that the way you wash cars is you just drive them into the lake, and then you wash them. So these guys are exposing themselves all day long to this contaminated lake water. You know, other people would be, for example, fishermen, kids in particular. A lot of kids get this disease early on because it's hot. It's really, really hot. And there's a nice body of water. So what are you going to do? You're going to go in the water. Your parents say, don't go in the water. You're going to go in the water when they're not looking. So they get infected. People doing laundry in irrigation ditches or washing kitchen utensils in irrigation dishes. They're getting their exposure to the larvae of this parasite. So this is what happens 6 weeks after you get infected. The larvae grow up into mom and dad. So dad is the big worm here, and mom is the skinny worm. Now mom is living in a split in dad's body, and they're living in your bloodstream. And how do they survive? They eat your hemoglobin. They eat your red blood cells, right? So now you're thinking, oh, this is a parasite. It's living in my bloodstream. This thing is about an inch long, living in your bloodstream, eating your red blood cells. It gets worse. Individual worms can live for 10 years or more, right? So this isn't like a cold virus, right, or bacteria. 10 years, right? And I don't think there's anyone here who is under 21, so I can say these worms are having sex, right? And they continuously have sex, 24/7, okay? The female is in this split in the male's body, and as a result, the female produces hundreds to thousands of eggs per day. And ironically, it's not the worms that give you the disease, it's the eggs. And the eggs wash up into your liver, and they block blood flow, and so the classic picture that you see in textbooks is the individual. This is a young man from Egypt who has an enlarged liver and an enlarged spleen, and basically a lot of fluid in his abdomen. This is just like what happens in this country with someone with alcoholic cirrhosis, right? So this disease, schistosomiasis, damages the liver the way alcohol damages the liver, and so you sort of block blood flow through the liver, and actually all of the signs and symptoms are very similar to what you see with alcoholic cirrhosis. But this picture is relatively rare. Maybe 10% of people who get infected get to this severe stage of infection. However, just about everybody gets this: anemia, seizures, developmental delay in kids, and sexual dysfunction. None of that is good, right? I mean, just take anemia, for example. A worm living in your body for 10 years or more, and you're anemic, and you know what happens with anemia. That's low hemoglobin, low red blood cells. You feel fatigue. So imagine chronic fatigue syndrome due to a parasite for decades, right? And so what happens is that this disease, schistosomiasis, is actually worse than something like Ebola because it doesn't kill you. Instead, it really just destroys your ability to work a full day. So if you're a kid in school, forget about being able to concentrate in school for a full day, or someone working in a factory, or a farmer working in a field. They just aren't able to do that, just get tired all the time. So what this disease does is it pulls down the whole socioeconomic level of a village or a region. It just doesn't kill people, it actually destroys their society. So that's what I think makes these types of diseases so terrible. Okay, so those were a couple of examples. I could give you many more. That was Chagas disease, the trypanosome, the single-cell organism, schistosomiasis, this weird inch-long worm lives in your bloodstream, okay? And in both of those cases, I told you in the case of Chagas disease, we don't even have any approved drugs. In the case of schistosomiasis, there is one good drug. It's called praziquantel, works really well, but everybody's worried because there's only one drug. And we all know what happens with drug resistance with these organisms. So there's a lot of effort right now to try to figure out, can we come up with a backup just in case something bad happens? So here's the question: where can we look for new drugs? So I told you that there's little or no interest in the pharmaceutical industry. And I said little on purpose, because there are people in the pharmaceutical industry who will donate compounds that could be drugs to laboratories who are working on these diseases. Now, who are the laboratories working on those diseases? Well, I told you they're not in drug companies, but they are in universities, they're in institutes, they're in government agencies, so they're basically all the nonprofits kind of thing, right? So how do these companies deliver these compounds? Well, it's a very interesting process, and I'll give you an example. I go around to companies and I tell them this story, and invariably there's some vice president there who says, you know, oh, we understand this is really terrible, we're really sorry, I'm so glad you're working on this. Well, we're not working on this, and we're not going to. And here's your other ethical issue to think about. This is actually a quote from one of the VPs at one of the companies I went to. He said, you have to remember, we're a business, we're not a philanthropy. Okay? So they see it as no way they can make money, they're beholden to their stockholders. So, you know, for them, there's really no question. However, as I'm walking out of the room, somebody would come up to me and they go, hey, you know, I just want to tell you, I'm a chemist. I'm actually the director of chemistry at in Summit, New Jersey, and that kind of tells you what company that was. You know, I'd like to send you some compounds to test. You know, they could be drugs. They're pretty good. I said, well, that's great. And he said, just don't tell my vice president I'm doing this, right? And I said, well, why are you motivated to do this? And I'll tell you, I've heard this story so many times. The guy will say, you know, before I came and worked for one of these big companies, I was in the Peace Corps in Africa, and I saw what happened with kids with cerebral malaria. And so it's really great, because I think a lot of the people who actually are working in these companies are people who understand the social dilemma that's having to be dealt with out there. And that's why all these companies have been willing to just, you know, give some compounds. And they're not going to give you anything which is going to lead to the next Lipitor or the next Viagra, but they are going to give you things that maybe fell by the wayside, and that's fine. You know, it's at least a starting place. So that's one source. The second source is what I call the unexplored chemical space. And that is what are called natural products, right? So I think many of you have probably read that the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology was given to 3 people who were working on neglected diseases. One of them was a woman from China who had discovered a drug called artemisinin, which is now the leading drug for the treatment of malaria all over the world. It's what the WHO uses. And artemisinin actually comes from a plant, Artemisia, right, wormwood, and it's a natural product, right? And so because we're here in San Diego, and we have one of the premier oceanographic institutes in the world here, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, is just a really logical thing to turn to the marine biologists there and say, hey, you know, give us some things from the sea. And some of you may know that the whole natural product business was a huge part of what the pharmaceutical industry was doing 20, 30 years ago, but then they stopped, and they stopped because of 2 reasons. One, these natural products are basically Mother Nature's chemistry. So any of you who are chemists know that they're big, they're huge molecules, they're very complex, and they can't be easily synthesized, so you can't usually manufacture them, okay? So that was one problem. And then companies got into these things called small molecules. Okay, small molecules are things that are less, if you, again, know chemistry, they're less than like 600 molecular weight, you know, so they're like a few carbons and a few fluorines, things like that. You can make a lot of them. So the companies that I mentioned will have small molecule compound libraries that run into the millions of these things. So that's where everybody's putting their effort because they're easy to make. But if you think about the antibiotics that you take for bacterial infections, they're almost all natural products. Anything that ends in mycin, erythromycin, streptomycin, not to mention penicillin, right, from a mold, you know, just mention artemisinin from a plant. And so I think it's time that people go back, particularly for these neglected diseases, and look at natural products. So, you know, that's one huge source. And the difference now is that these marine biologists are smart, and they said, okay, we understand we have to have something that you can go back and get a lot of. And so what they do is they go in to collect marine sediment, and they only provide compounds that come from marine organisms like bacteria or fungal-like organisms that can be grown in large quantities so you can get a lot of the stuff. So it's called fermentation. It's like when you make beer, right? So only fermentable organisms. So this is not things from sponges or coral where, you know, gee, how would you do that without destroying a reef, right? These are from fermentable organisms. And now, as many of you know, this whole post-genomic era means that for very low cost, you can take one of those organisms and you can do the whole gene sequence. And therefore, you can identify the biosynthetic pathway for this natural product. And if it happens to be something which kills one of our parasites, then if you can't get it directly by growing up these bacteria, you can take that set of genes and you can graft it into yeast, and you can have yeast be your factory. Okay, so that's another way that this game is being played. So I think this is really, you know, an area that will be really fruitful because 2/3 of all the drugs we take have their origins in natural products. That's another factor that they told me. And you know, you might imagine, okay, so I showed you where these guys are diving off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, you know, it's pretty. And I said, hey, is this where you get all your bacteria? They said, oh, no. We dive here, but this is not where we get most of our stuff. I said, well, where do you get most of your stuff? And they said, well, from areas of high biodiversity. Oh, that sounds important. What's an area of high biodiversity? They say, oh, like Tahiti, Costa Rica, Fiji. And okay, I get it. So you guys go diving, these plates, oh, it's terrible. Somebody's got to do it, you know, go collect the stuff. So that's where they're getting it. Okay. So the final piece and where you look for new drugs is something I call circumventing the pipeline. So I told you that this whole pipeline, right? And it's expensive. And so this is sometimes called repurposing. So what does this mean? Okay, there's a whole bunch of drugs that are already out there and we're taking them, okay, for other things, right? Maybe statins for lowering cholesterol, maybe, you know, blood pressure, diabetes, whatever, asthma, all right? What if one of those drugs happens to kill one of these parasites? That would be great because all the testing has already been done. It's been in people, you know, how much to take, all this kind of stuff. So that's what this game is. And it seems really silly, but in fact, there's so few people working in this area that nobody really did this, right? And so there are things that have fallen out. I'll just tell you one example. It's a drug called eradicate. It was approved for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis in the 1980s. It's orally bioavailable, it's cheap. We know everything of its, you know, it's been given for months. Now, of course, it's been supplanted by 8 other things that are better for rheumatoid arthritis. But this turns out to be very effective against parasites like entamoeba, the thing that causes diarrheal disease. So this drug actually can go directly into a clinical trial. It doesn't have to go through all of that expensive pre-testing stuff. It can go directly in. So that's really great. Okay. So what tools do we have to try to do this? So you saw on one of my very first slides that whatever this process is, it's got to be inexpensive, right? And it's got to be something that can be done outside of the pharmaceutical industry. So one tool that's available is that we and others have managed to establish you might call them colonies, cultures of all of these organisms that produce these diseases. So you can actually screen drugs against these organisms. Now, are they scary? Actually, no, because it's not like TB or there's no aerosol thing. So the biosafety level is actually more like hepatitis. It's basically a blood-borne pathogen. So unless you inject yourself, you're okay. The one difference is this thing I already told you about, schistosomiasis, because of that little larvae that can go through your skin, right? So if you have to raise that in the snails, all you need to do is to tell people, do not stick your hand in the water, okay? So as long as people don't stick their hand in the water, they're okay, right? So all of these are being grown. And equally important, there are animal models of disease that mimic what happens in people, so that if you have something that looks like a drug, you can test it in one of these animal models. And that's really important for the FDA because they want to see this in vivo efficacy. Okay, so that's available. The second thing that's available is something that makes screening cheaper and faster, and that's robotics. So you got to take advantage of new technology. And so there are many places now that have a set of instruments. I won't go into detail because you'll get bored with them, but suffice it to say they're instruments that allow you to move liquid in very small quantities, put parasites in little plastic wells, and do it all without human hands being involved because you have a robotic arm that moves things back and forth, okay? And then you have an automated imaging system that allows you to look at the parasites and see whether or not your potential drug is killing them, whether it's safe, it doesn't kill the host cells. So these things are all available. This I'll just mention because it's very interesting. This is a liquid handler that uses sound waves instead of pressure. And so this can actually just deposit 1 nanoliter, that's 10 to the minus 9th liters, that's very small, into a well. And that's important because, as you might imagine, even though you can get these compound, they call them libraries, from companies, they won't give you very much. And if you're screening against 10 parasites, you've got to be doing it in a nano scale, right? So that's what this instrument allows you to do. This little tiny thing costs more than a Tesla. Okay. The other thing that you can do, which is cost effective, is you can use computers. Okay, so one thing is this thing called structure-based drug design. So what is that? So that means that you have a molecular target in one of these parasites. So this thing that looks like an asteroid in the background is actually a crystal structure of a protein target in this Chagas disease parasite. And this little stick thing here is a series of chemicals that were synthesized to block the action of this target. So a medicinal chemist and someone who solves these structures can solve a series of structures of the chemical docked into the what's called active site of this protein. And so there's an iterative back and forth where the chemist looks at this and goes, oh, you know, what if I put something right here? I could probably interact with this green region here and that would give me better binding. Okay, so that's the way the game's played. That's why it's called structure-based drug design. It's really design. So it's sort of designing things on the, with the help of the computer. So again, this is a very inexpensive way to move things and very focused in terms of telling a small number of chemists what to do next, okay? So just to end, I just say that, well, that's all great, but we're still only talking about this part. If you do this repurposing, yeah, you can jump from here to here. Cool. But what if you can't? What about all these other things? What about a natural product? You still have to go through all these steps. So this is a lot. And this will show it to you in another way. So everything I told you about gets you up to about here, right? You can show efficacy in maybe in a mouse model of disease. But what about all this part? What about synthesizing it in a form that is okay for people? How about making sure that it's safe, not only in rodents, but the FDA asks for a second animal, okay? What about the metabolism of the drug? What about how you're going to take it? Hey, is this going to be a pill, a suspension? Am I going to inject it? Am I going to take it by mouth? Okay, that's what formulation is. This all costs you upwards of well, the cheapest would be about $2 million. Companies will tell you $5 to $10 million to do this. So who's going to pay for this? So I'll just tell you one story, which is kind of interesting. So we were developing a drug for Chagas disease, and the only people that would support us were the National Institutes of Health. So I went to the National Institutes of Health, and I showed them all this data, which showed that this is really working in animal models and all this. And the person there, who's called a program officer, said, oh, this is really great. And I said, well, what we need to make it into something that's more like a drug now, we need to do all of this preclinical stuff, which companies call the valley of death, because this is where many drugs fail, right? So he said, well, wait, I just want you to talk to someone. And so he brought in a woman, her name was Beth Spinelli, and I told her the whole story again. And she said, well, that's really great. Chagas disease is important. Okay, but can you just tell me, does this drug work on any of these diseases? And she pulled out a list of the biodefense organisms, right? These things, these bioterrorist organisms, right? And it just turned out that I had sent this to a friend of mine who was at McGill University in Canada, and he showed that it was effective against Cryptosporidium, and that was on their list. And she said, I said, oh, well, yeah, Cryptosporidium. She said, oh, thank you. And they paid for all of this because, as many of you know, Congress continues to directly give the National Institutes of Health a whole bunch of money because they're worried about bioterrorism, okay? And so if you happen to be on this list, but what if you're not on the list? Then that's a problem, okay? If you're not on the list, then how are you going to do this? So the final thing I'll just tell you is we've now set up at what I call a little pipeline. And how did we do this? I had to go around, all around the San Diego area and identify laboratories who happen to be doing each one of these steps. And it turns out that there are laboratories in institutes, universities, et cetera, that do each one of these steps. And I won't go into this in detail, just to tell you that I would go there and I'd be just amazed. There was someone doing drug metabolism. There was someone doing pharmacokinetics. There's someone doing safety studies in beagle dogs. I mean, everything the FDA would want. But they had never talked to anyone else. They all had their own little project. So I just went to them and I said, would you like to be part of something bigger? And they said, oh, sure. They just never thought about it. So now there's this thing called the drug development pipeline, and it takes care of this translational bit, right, until you get into people. And I think it's really important, and it's only there for people working on orphan or neglected diseases, because if you're working on something that's commercially viable, you're going to have an industry partner, and they're going to take care of all of this. I can just tell you, they usually outsource it to other parts of the world where there are companies doing this. But anyway, this exists now. So those are the tools. So there's, I would say, the ethical conundrum of huge global health problems, very little interest. And then there's the challenge, and then there's the hope. And I'd say there is hope, but it's this hope, okay? So I'll just end by saying I owe a lot to these people at SIO because they're just, I think they're incredible in terms of what they're providing. And just so you get an idea of who funds this kind of thing, well, the US government does to some extent, but I can tell you about 1% of what they put into prostate cancer. The Gates Foundation, yeah, but they're mostly into the implementation side. Some of you may know Carlos Slim in Mexico, right? He has a health foundation. They funded some of this. Chavez is actually the Brazilian government. So there are some other governments who want to get involved if they have any money. And then this is actually the European Union. So the European Union is involved. And their interest is, there's actually a lot of stuff going on in Europe on some of these diseases because, as many of you know, many of the countries in Africa were former colonies of European countries. So that's where their interest comes from. It doesn't really matter. They have interest as well. So those are the people who give you hope. And I'll end there. Thanks.
I'd like to ask you a few questions of my own before we take questions from the audience. I'm really interested in how you became interested in this area of research.
Right. Actually, I was just talking to someone, as you heard, before I came here, I was at the University of California in San Francisco, and my original interest was in cancer biology. And I was studying how cancer cells move through tissue. And I went to a lecture by a parasitologist who was just mentioned. His name is Donald Heinemann. He was basically an epidemiology type. And he talked about the schistosome parasite, and he talked about the fact that it has this larva, which is 1,000 cells, and it goes right through skin. You don't need an insect bite, you don't need a burn, you don't need an abrasion, right through skin. I went, whoa, that's pretty amazing. And that got me hooked.
How long ago was that?
You don't want to know.
Yes, I do.
I don't know. That was in the 80s, okay. You know, the time of the B-52s and, you know, a lot of good music coming out of Athens, Georgia.
So when we're talking about neglected diseases from tropical countries, what countries are we talking about?
Well, you know, the tropical world is that whole swath that goes on either side of the equator. So a lot of these diseases are endemic all over, like leishmaniasis. We didn't talk about that, but that's a disease which affects basically every part of the world. Interestingly, there are different species that tend to be in different parts of the world, and sometimes the type of disease that you get from leishmania can be different depending upon if you're South America or India or Africa. On the other hand, there are diseases like, you know, since you know about schistosomiasis now, that's a disease primarily of Africa and the Middle East. Okay. It's also in Southeast Asia, it used to be in Japan, it's in the Philippines, and certain islands, but it's also a huge problem in Brazil. And it got to Brazil with slave trade. So some of these diseases originated in one place and then moved to another because of some historical human event. In this case, it was slave trade. And one of the ironies about these diseases, and schistosomiasis is a very good one, is if you go to Brazil, you go to the old cemeteries, people point out to you people who died from schistosomiasis. They're almost all Portuguese. Because the Africans, they would get sick, they would get this chronic disease, but they wouldn't get the really severe form of the disease. And that's true also of malaria in Africa as well.
Interesting. If you could have one wish, if you could change things, how would you do it? Would you do research in this country? Would you do research and for treatment on patients in their native country? What would you do differently?
Well, if I had one wish, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but if I had one wish, it would be that a U.S. senator would get schistosomiasis. Because if a U.S. senator got schistosomiasis, we would see a lot more funding of this area. But I don't wish that on anybody. You know, I go to a lot of different places because that's where you do your clinical trials. And, you know, I guess what strikes me is that it doesn't matter where you go, people really want to do something about these health problems. And what really encourages me is the young people really want to do something about it. And the young people in every country, they want to do research, they want to go to school. You know, this is one of the driving forces to get kids to be interested in things like chemistry that they wouldn't normally be interested in. So I find that really invigorating and very positive.
I'm wondering, why is it that we can't eradicate? The example that I recall is driving your car into the water to wash it in Kenya, and the car washer is getting this bug from the water. Why can't we attack the bug in the water and wipe that out, thus wiping out for future generations this disease?
Well, there's been a lot of efforts to control some of these diseases by interrupting the life cycle of the parasite. And the issue that people run into is, like I mentioned with the molluscicides, the snail killing things, is that it's really difficult to do anything in a large body of water. I mean, so these larvae tend to be coming out of the snails in certain parts and then they move around. One of the amazing things about them is they come out and they go to the top and they sit in the top of the water and they don't use up much energy. They're very much like mosquito larvae. And then when you step in, you create a little current and they start moving. So they can recognize current. And then they find you because they can follow a thermal gradient. They're like heat-seeking missiles, right? So these things are really highly evolved to find you, right? And to try to get rid of them in a large body, like a lake, it would be really hard because you'd have to put something in there in such high concentration, it would undoubtedly affect the rest of the ecosystem, and that's what really happens. There's no way to be so specific that you can get rid of this one organism without affecting other organisms. So that's a big problem with water. Another thing, maybe you were hinting at it, is, well, how about hygiene? You know, I mean, if people didn't pee and defecate in water, there wouldn't be this problem because there wouldn't be transmission, right? And to us, it seems, well, this is really logical. Why don't we just go there and tell people, you know, let's build latrines? Well, you know, you really have to understand people's attitudes towards this because, you know, I've been places where they were building latrines and the people in the village said, why would we all want to go defecate in the same place? It smells terrible. Why don't we just spread it around because we don't smell it? I mean, try to argue against that. Or in a case of schistosomiasis where the eggs might come out in urine, where you got somebody going out on a lake fishing all day. Are you going to tell those guys, oh, got to pee, oh, why don't you come on all the way back, bring your boat all the way back, you know, and then go up to the tree. Then get back in your boat and go all the way out. No, you're just going to pee in the lake.
So why is this country responsible for the world when it comes to these neglected tropical diseases? I know you mentioned that we do have some of it in this country, but why are we responsible for curing everybody in the world?
Right. Why are we responsible for climate change? Why are we responsible for anything? I think there's two aspects of that. One is that I don't mean to say that we're the only country trying to do something about these diseases. As I mentioned, there's a lot of research going on in Europe. And I was just in Brazil last month. There's a lot of research going on in Brazil on the diseases that affect their population. But, you know, a lot of it has to do with where, you know, where are the resources? Where's the funding for doing this research? And Brazil really tries, but as many of you know, they just had a big economic downturn. They really are putting a lot of money into science. They were sending their students all over the world for training. Now they can't do it because they're in an economic decline. You know, I think it's more, you know, you have to look which countries should be working on these things. We certainly should, and I think people are beginning to realize that these aren't exotic diseases anymore, that anybody who does so-called adventure travel is going to run into them. I mean, any of you who've gone on safari in Africa have to take malaria prophylaxis, right? I mean, you know, so, you know, there's that part of it. And then there's, of course, the fact that we tend to send a lot of our young people on military excursions to places like the Tigris and Euphrates River, which happens to flow through Iraq, and there's a lot of schistosomiasis there. So there's that. And then there's air travel. I mean, you know, we all saw what happened, Ebola comes here. Well, a lot of other things can come here too. They just don't kill you right away. Maybe it's actually worse. They don't kill you right away.
I know about 10 years ago, I took a tour of the Painted Caves, one of the series of painted caves down in Baja. And our tour guide said, just hop in this body of water. And he gave me an inner tube and said, kick till you get to the other side. And I looked at this black water, so dark that you couldn't see a quarter of an inch into it to see what had caused it to be black. And I bet you wouldn't have gotten in that water, but I did, and I've been worried about it ever since.
You didn't get schistosomiasis because it's not in Mexico. But
what did I get?
I don't know. But there's a lot of bacteria in there, I'm sure. Yeah, you might be interested. I mean, how do you actually, when these things get eradicated, how did they get eradicated? Well, just one story you might be interested in. Puerto Rico used to have a lot of schistosomiasis. And I have a good friend who is the dean of the medical school there, and I said, hey, you know, you don't have it anymore. He says, yeah, you know why? Because we created all these malls and we paved over all the waterways, and so we don't have any waterways anymore for the organisms to breed in. It's now all asphalt and mini malls.
So if I just hang out at the mall, I'll be safe?
If you hang out at the mall, you'll be safe. There's no schistosomiasis there.
All right. Is it more efficient, less expensive for us to study the treatment of these diseases in the country itself, or can't we do it more cheaply here?
Well, it's sort of impossible to do a real clinical trial here because as yet there are not enough people to do the statistical part of it, right? You can do the safety studies here, no problem, because that's just, quote, normal healthy volunteers. So the FDA said, oh, you can now take your drug, you do a safety study in normal healthy volunteers. And I went, wait a second, do I know anyone who's normal and healthy? But they said, oh, we mean medical students. Okay. You can do some things here, but if you're talking about a lot of these diseases, even malaria, certainly sleeping sickness, you have to go to the areas where these diseases are endemic to find enough people who are infected to do the clinical trial. And that has its own challenges.
Set of problems. So if American researchers do clinical trials in a foreign country, are they still bound by the FDA?
Oh, it's a very good question. If the funding, clinical trials cost money too, right? Because you recruit people, you have to pay them something, you have a staff that takes care of them, you have to do blood tests, the blood tests cost, so you can imagine. If the funding to do that clinical trial comes from, say, the National Institutes of Health, you have to follow the guidelines of the National Institutes of Health in the United States, regardless of where you are elsewhere in the world. That's not to say that, a lot of countries have adopted those same guidelines, which is good because it protects people. But as many of you probably know, there are a lot of countries that have not adopted those guidelines, and that's where a lot of companies have gone and tested their HIV drugs and things like that because they could do it very easily, right? But if you get any funding, you have to follow strict US guidelines.
All right. So these pharmaceutical companies, especially the ones that have recently merged with others, what are they doing with their profits if they're not spending it on research that's needed?
Well, if anybody here owns stock in any of these companies, you're hoping that one of the things they're doing with their profits is increasing your stock price. Okay, so that's part of it. They have huge, as you saw, they have huge numbers of employees that they have to pay, benefits, all of that. That's why now, especially in this sort of post-merger period, you really can't even think about working on a drug for something that's not going to make you $1 billion or more. That's just the bottom line. And so what's ironic about that is if you think about what can you make $1 billion on? Well, there's only a handful of diseases that you can make $1 billion on, and they're not diseases which you cure, right? So a lot of companies have totally gotten out of infectious disease because you're not going to make that much money if you give an antibiotic for 10 days or 20 days, even if you charge $50,000 for it, because the disease is gone. What you want is a disease which you manage, not which you cure. So think about the diseases which you manage. I bet you there are a lot of people here who are on some of these medications. Diabetes, you don't cure diabetes, you manage it. You manage your blood sugar. High blood pressure, you manage your high blood pressure, right? Cholesterol, you lower your cholesterol. Asthma or allergies, you get seasonal allergies. Yeah, every year you get a seasonal allergy for the rest of your life. So to make money, you need to have people take a drug for the rest of their life. Otherwise, it's not going to be profitable.
I want to thank you again, Dr. Macaro, for your time and for giving us this wonderful presentation. It was very, very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.